My husband invited me to a high-stakes business dinner with a Japanese investor. I smiled politely, nodded along, and played the quiet, supportive wife he expected. What he never imagined was that I understood fluent Japanese. So when he spoke about me to that client, laughing softly, I realized in that moment that my life was about to change forever. I had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible. At business dinners, I smiled when required, poured drinks when glasses were empty, and spoke only when spoken to. My husband, Ken, liked it that way. To him, I was an accessory, presentable, quiet, useful when needed, and easily ignored when not. That night was no different. The restaurant was elegant, understated, the kind that whispered power rather than flaunted it. Across the table sat Mr. Takahashi, a Japanese investor whose partnership could elevate Ken's company to a level he had chased for years. Ken was animated, confident, almost charming. He spoke about numbers, projections, and future expansion with practiced ease. I nodded occasionally, keeping my posture straight, my expression neutral. I could see how proud Ken felt, how certain he was that everything was under his control. What he didn't see was how carefully I listened, not just to him, but to every word spoken in Japanese. Years ago, I had learned the language quietly, patiently, for reasons that no longer mattered. It had become a skill I kept to myself, something that belonged only to me. At first, the conversation was strictly business, but as the wine flowed, Ken relaxed. He leaned back slightly, lowering his voice, assuming I was too distracted or too ignorant to understand. He laughed and made a comment to Mr. Takahashi in Japanese about how having a compliant wife made his professional life easier. I kept my smile steady. Then he went further. He spoke about my lack of ambition, how I was content living in his shadow, how I was fortunate he had allowed me the life I lived. Each sentence landed quietly but sharply, like a blade pressed against skin. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react. Inside, something shifted. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was clarity. For the first time in years, I heard how he truly saw me, stripped of politeness and performance. To Ken, I wasn't a partner. I was proof of his superiority. Mr. Takahashi glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable. He responded politely, changing the subject, but the damage was done. Ken continued, emboldened by his own arrogance, joking about how wives were best kept away from real decisions. I noticed how carefully Mr. Takahashi chose his words afterward, how the tone of the meeting subtly cooled. Ken didn't notice. He was too busy congratulating himself. When the dinner ended, Ken was pleased. He squeezed my hand and told me I had done well, as though I were a child who had behaved at a formal event. In the car, he talked about future deals, about how close he was to success. I stared out the window, watching city lights blur together, replaying every word he thought I couldn't understand. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, listening to Ken breathe beside me, realizing how long I had been shrinking myself to fit into the space he allowed. I thought about the sacrifices I'd made, the opportunities I'd declined, the intelligence I'd hidden to keep the peace. I wondered when silence had become my default and when endurance had been mistaken for weakness. By morning, nothing had changed on the surface. I prepared breakfast, answered emails, moved through the day as usual, but internally I had crossed a line I couldn't step back over. I began paying closer attention, not just to Ken's words, but to his habits, his accounts, the way he guarded certain details while boasting about others. I wasn't searching for revenge. I was searching for truth. In the days that followed, I noticed inconsistencies I had previously ignored. Meetings that ran too late, expenses that didn't align with business needs, conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Ken assumed my silence meant ignorance. He had no idea it meant observation. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions. I simply listened, learned, and remembered. The woman he underestimated was finally awake, and she was no longer interested in playing the role he had written for her. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment it truly began. Once I started paying attention, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Ken had always been careful with numbers around me, but now I saw how selective his transparency truly was. Bank statements arrived late, passwords changed without explanation. When I asked casual questions, he deflected with charm or irritation depending on his mood. I responded with calm acceptance, the same quiet compliance he believed defined me. In reality, I was collecting fragments, slowly assembling a picture he never intended me to see. I began revisiting old documents stored in our home office, contracts, invoices, partnership agreements he assumed bored me. Late at night, after Ken fell asleep, I read through them carefully. Some figures didn't match. Certain payments were routed through unfamiliar accounts. At first, I wondered if I was misunderstanding something. Then I noticed the same name appearing again and again, tucked discreetly into financial footnotes. A consulting firm I'd never heard of, receiving steady transfers over the past year. I researched quietly. The firm was small, recently established, and registered to a residential address. No employees listed, no public portfolio. It didn't take long to connect the dots. The address belonged to a woman Ken claimed was just a colleague, a woman's name he avoided saying aloud, a woman's existence I had sensed long before I had proof. The realization settled over me slowly, not as shock, but as confirmation. This wasn't just betrayal of trust, it was strategic. He wasn't simply unfaithful, he was using company resources to fund a double life. Every luxury gift, every discreet trip, every late meeting had been paid for with money he publicly boasted about earning through discipline and integrity. What surprised me most wasn't the affair itself. It was how little guilt he carried. At home, he spoke about loyalty and respect as abstract values, ideals he liked to reference when it suited him. Meanwhile, he treated me as both shield and excuse, someone who made him appear stable, respectable, trustworthy to outsiders. I thought about the dinner with Mr. Takahashi, about the subtle shift in tone, about the way respect can evaporate the moment character is exposed. Ken had underestimated more than just me that night. He had underestimated how closely others were watching. I began documenting everything: screenshots, copies, timelines. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I moved with patience, the kind born from years of being overlooked. Ken mistook my silence for weakness. In truth, it was discipline. I had learned long ago that reacting too quickly only benefited those who believed they held power. At social gatherings, I observed how Ken spoke about women when he thought no one important was listening, how easily he dismissed opinions that challenged his own. I had been one of those people for too long. Meanwhile, Ken grew more careless. Success made him bold. He spoke openly about future deals, about expanding into international markets, about investors lining up to trust him. He never once questioned why I listened so intently now, why I asked thoughtful but harmless-sounding questions. He assumed curiosity without consequence. At night, alone with my thoughts, I felt a mixture of grief and resolve. Grief for the years I had given to a version of him that didn't truly exist. Resolve because I finally understood the position I was in. I knew his language, I knew his weaknesses, and most importantly, I knew the truth. I wasn't planning destruction. I wasn't driven by rage. What I wanted was balance, an end to the illusion that he alone controlled the narrative. For years, Ken had written my role for me. Now, quietly and deliberately, I was preparing to revise the script. When the moment came, it wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be dramatic, it would be precise, and he would never see it coming. The more I learned, the calmer I became. Knowledge has a way of steadying the heart, even when it reveals unpleasant truths. I no longer questioned my instincts. Instead, I trusted them, allowing logic to guide me where emotion once held me back. I started thinking less like a wife and more like an observer, someone detached enough to see patterns clearly. Ken's behavior shifted subtly as weeks passed. He became more protective of his phone, stepping out to take calls, lowering his voice even when he thought I wasn't nearby. He complained about pressure at work, about partners who didn't understand his vision. I listened, offering sympathetic nods, careful not to interrupt. He mistook my attentiveness for loyalty. It never occurred to him that loyalty without respect slowly transforms into strategy. I decided to consult a financial advisor under the pretense of reviewing my own savings. The meeting was discreet, professional, and revealing. With carefully phrased questions, I confirmed what I already suspected. Ken's actions weren't just unethical, they were risky. If exposed, they could unravel his entire operation. Hearing it from an expert didn't frighten me, it clarified my options. I also sought legal advice, quietly, methodically. I learned how information mattered more than accusation, evidence more than emotion, timing more than confrontation. Each meeting strengthened my resolve, not to retaliate impulsively, but to protect myself intelligently. I had spent years avoiding conflict. Now I understood that avoidance had only delayed the inevitable. At home, Ken continued performing the role of the successful husband. He talked about future plans that no longer included me in any meaningful way. Vacations postponed, conversations shortened, decisions made without consultation. He was already living as though I were optional. Accepting that truth was painful, but it also freed me from the need to preserve something already broken. I paid close attention to his interactions with others, how deferential he was to people he considered powerful, how dismissive he became with those he thought depended on him. It was a hierarchy he navigated instinctively, and I realized where he had placed me within it, far below himself. That realization hurt, but it also erased the last traces of doubt. One evening, Ken mentioned another upcoming meeting with international investors. He spoke excitedly, outlining how close he was to securing a major deal. I smiled and congratulated him. Inside, I noted the date, the location, and the names involved. He had no idea how familiar that world already was to me, how much I understood the dynamics he believed I couldn't grasp. That night, I reviewed my notes again. Everything was aligned, documents organized, conversations logged, advice considered. I wasn't rushing toward an ending, I was building toward a turning point. There is a difference. One is driven by impulse, the other by intention. I thought about who I had been at the beginning of our marriage, how I had believed partnership meant compromise, how often I had compromised myself instead. Growth, I realized, sometimes comes not from becoming stronger, but from becoming honest about where you stand. Ken slept soundly beside me, unaware that the ground beneath his certainty was already shifting. I didn't feel satisfaction in that moment. I felt clarity, the kind that arrives when you finally accept that waiting for someone to change is just another form of surrender. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking balance, truth, and autonomy. Whatever followed would be the result of his choices, not my silence. For the first time in years, I felt aligned with myself, steady and prepared. The next steps would require precision and patience, but I had both, and I was no longer afraid to use them. The opportunity arrived quietly, almost politely, as these moments often do. Ken announced a formal presentation dinner with several international stakeholders, including Mr. Takahashi. He framed it as another milestone, another step toward the recognition he believed he deserved. I listened, nodded, and agreed to attend. My calm acceptance reassured him. He assumed nothing had changed. That assumption was his greatest mistake. The evening unfolded in a familiar setting, elegant, controlled, designed to impress. Ken was in his element, confident and animated. I took my place beside him, composed, observant, saying little. The conversation flowed easily between English and Japanese. Ken, as before, believed himself safely superior, comfortably unaware of the meaning behind the words exchanged in a language he thought belonged only to others. At first, everything followed the expected rhythm: business projections, polite compliments, carefully measured optimism. Then Ken relaxed. Success had made him careless again. He leaned toward one of the investors and spoke in Japanese, this time more openly, joking about how he managed his household the same way he managed his company, with firm control and minimal interference. He laughed softly, confident in his privacy. I met Mr. Takahashi's eyes and responded calmly, in fluent Japanese, clarifying a technical point Ken had misrepresented moments earlier. The table fell silent. Ken's expression froze, confusion flickering across his face before giving way to something closer to panic. For the first time, he realized he had misjudged me, not just socially, but strategically. I didn't expose him, not yet. I simply participated. I asked thoughtful questions. I offered insights that demonstrated preparation and competence. I corrected inaccuracies with grace. Each word I spoke shifted the atmosphere subtly but decisively. Respect redirected, attention realigned. Ken spoke less as the evening progressed, uncertain, unsettled. After dinner, Ken confronted me privately. His voice was low, tense, demanding to know why I had never mentioned my language skills. I answered calmly, truthfully, "You never asked." The simplicity of the response unsettled him more than any accusation could have. He had always assumed knowledge flowed in one direction, from him outward. That illusion had cracked. In the days that followed, the tone at home changed. Ken oscillated between irritation and forced politeness. He knew something had shifted, though he didn't yet understand how far. I continued my routines, unprovoked, unreactive. Meanwhile, the investors followed up, not with him alone, but with questions directed at me. Subtle questions, strategic ones. I responded carefully, offering clarity without undermining him openly. I didn't need to. The contrast spoke for itself. Where Ken relied on bravado, I relied on preparation. Where he assumed authority, I demonstrated it, quietly. Soon after, Ken's consulting arrangement came under scrutiny. An internal review began, prompted not by accusation, but by inconsistencies that could no longer be ignored. Ken tried to manage the situation, but his confidence faltered. He wasn't used to operating without full control of the narrative. At home, the distance between us widened. Conversations became transactional. Trust, whatever remained of it, evaporated. I no longer felt the need to explain myself. I had already done enough explaining to myself. One evening, Ken admitted he felt undermined. The word lingered in the air. I asked him, calmly, what he meant. He couldn't articulate it. What he felt wasn't sabotage, it was exposure. He had built his authority on assumptions that no longer held. I didn't celebrate his discomfort, I acknowledged it. Growth rarely feels comfortable, especially when it arrives uninvited. I had spent years adapting to his expectations. Now he was being forced to adapt to reality. As the review progressed, Ken became quieter, more cautious. The confidence he once carried effortlessly now required effort. And I realized something important. Power doesn't disappear when challenged, it transfers. I hadn't taken anything from him. I had simply stepped into the space he never believed I could occupy. And from that moment on, nothing between us would ever return to the way it was. I didn't seek confrontation, but it arrived anyway. The review intensified, and Ken's world tightened around him. Meetings multiplied, deadlines shortened, and his phone never stopped buzzing. At home, silence replaced arguments. I observed, listening more than speaking, learning how pressure reveals truth. Ken began rehearsing explanations, polishing versions of events that favored him. I nodded, neither agreeing nor resisting. My restraint unsettled him more than anger ever had. Control, I learned, weakens fastest when it is questioned quietly, without spectacle or threat. He sensed the shift, yet couldn't stop it from happening. Momentum had chosen a different direction already. I received an email from Mr. Takahashi requesting clarification on several strategic points. He copied Ken, but the questions were addressed to me. I replied thoughtfully, referencing data, timelines, and cultural considerations Ken often overlooked. The exchange remained professional, courteous, unmistakably revealing. Ken called me afterward, voice tight. He asked why I was involved. I answered honestly. They asked. Nothing more was required. Authority follows competence, not titles. That realization unsettled him. He had spent years building status, while I had been building skill. Now the difference mattered. The silence that followed said everything he couldn't admit aloud. It lingered. I began preparing quietly for independence, not escape, but readiness. I organized documents, updated records, and reconnected with contacts I had neglected. Each small action steadied me. Ken noticed my calm, mistaking it for compliance. He spoke cautiously now, measuring words he once tossed carelessly. At night, I reflected on how invisible labor becomes powerful when recognized. I had learned languages, patterns, and people. I understood systems because I had survived inside them. Confidence grew without noise. I didn't need permission to evolve. Ken was adjusting to limits. I was expanding beyond them. The distance between us clarified choices ahead. The investigation concluded sooner than expected. Findings were neutral publicly, damaging privately. Ken's advancement stalled, his influence reduced. He blamed timing, politics, misunderstandings. I recognized consequence. He grew defensive, scanning for loyalty he could no longer assume. I remained steady. One evening he asked if I planned to leave. I met his gaze. "I'm planning to live honestly," I said. The answer frightened him. It offered no reassurance, no bargain. He realized then that persuasion wouldn't restore comfort. Trust had expired. Habit alone couldn't sustain us. He slept poorly. I slept deeply. Resolve does that. Silence served decisively for me. I consulted an attorney, not in anger but in clarity. Questions were asked, options outlined, boundaries defined. Knowledge replaced fear. Ken sensed preparation without understanding its shape. He attempted charm, apologies wrapped in nostalgia. I listened kindly, unmoved. Regret without accountability changes nothing. My future required structure, not promises. We discussed timelines, logistics, dignity. I chose discretion. There would be no scenes, no revenge. Strength didn't require spectacle. Ken watched opportunity close slowly, like a door he assumed stayed open. I stepped forward, carrying lessons, not bitterness. The past had taught me enough. What remained was choice, direction, and peace. By the time decisions became unavoidable, I felt steady, not numb, not hardened, just clear. Ken understood then that outcomes had weight. His voice softened, losing authority it once assumed. We separated respectfully, if imperfectly. I reclaimed space, time, and voice. Work expanded, friendships returned. Language remained my quiet ally. Growth didn't announce itself, it unfolded. Looking back, I don't resent him. I learned from imbalance. Power hoarded erodes. Power shared endures. My life grew larger when I stopped shrinking. The future waited, open, honest, and earned. I walked toward it without looking back, carrying only what strengthened me onward. Time softened the sharp edges, but it didn't erase memory, it refined it. In the months after everything settled, I learned what quiet success feels like. Not the loud kind that demands validation, but the steady kind that holds its shape even when no one is watching. My work gained visibility naturally, projects expanded, decisions came to me without negotiation, respect arrived without explanation. I didn't announce my transformation, people simply adjusted to it. That was the most telling part. When you stop asking to be seen, the world either steps up or steps away. Mine stepped up. I moved into a smaller place closer to the city. It wasn't grand, but it was mine in a way nothing before had been. I chose the furniture, the light, the silence. Evenings were no longer spent waiting for someone else's attention. I read, studied, and cooked meals that felt intentional. Independence isn't isolation, it's alignment. I noticed how my body relaxed when I didn't have to anticipate dismissal. The constant self-editing stopped. My thoughts flowed uninterrupted. I realized how exhausting it had been to live as an afterthought in my own life. That exhaustion never returned. I guarded that boundary fiercely. Occasionally, Ken reached out. Brief messages, polite updates, nothing urgent. I responded when necessary, neutrally. The emotional charge was gone. Distance had clarified everything. He sounded smaller somehow, not diminished, just constrained by limits he never expected. I wished him well sincerely. Resentment requires attachment, and I no longer carried it. Closure doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it arrives quietly, when your life grows so full there's no room left for old noise. I understood then that healing isn't dramatic, it's practical. You build a life that doesn't reopen the wound. Work took me abroad for the first time on my own terms. Meetings where my voice mattered, conversations where language became connection, not concealment. I spoke Japanese openly now, not as a reveal, not as leverage, but as myself. Each exchange reinforced the same truth. Competence speaks louder than assumption. People responded to clarity. I thrived in environments where curiosity was valued over control. Looking back, I wondered how much I had tolerated simply because it felt familiar. Familiarity is persuasive, but it is not safety. Growth requires unfamiliar ground. I learned to step onto it willingly. Friendships deepened, new ones formed without the quiet competition I once felt. I no longer minimized achievements or softened opinions, not to impress, not to dominate, just to exist honestly. That honesty attracted the right people. I laughed more, I rested better, I trusted my instincts again. The language I once learned in secret became a reminder. Anything you nurture consistently, even quietly, can change your life, especially the things no one applauds while you're building them. Those are often the most powerful. I carried that lesson forward deliberately. Years later, when people ask about turning points, I don't mention betrayal or shock. I talk about listening, about paying attention to what's said when someone thinks you can't understand. Not just words, but behavior, tone, absence. That's where truth lives. I didn't win by exposing anyone. I won by choosing myself without cruelty. Strength doesn't require humiliation, it requires resolve. My story isn't about language, it's about agency, about recognizing when you've been reduced and refusing to stay there, quietly, completely. If there's one thing I know now, it's this: you don't need permission to expand, not from a partner, a system, or a past version of yourself. You just need consistency and courage. Everything else follows. My life didn't become perfect, it became mine, and that made all the difference. I stopped being decorative, I became deliberate, and that choice, once made, reshaped everything that came after. So, if you're hearing this and you're living in a marriage where you feel unseen, where your ideas are brushed aside, where you're slowly taught to shrink, listen to that feeling. Trust it. Learn what empowers you. Pay attention. Collect the truth. Find your Emma. And when the moment comes, choose yourself. It won't be comfortable. It will shake everything you know. There will be nights filled with doubt and fear. But beyond that pain is a life where you stand fully in your worth, where your voice carries weight, where you are not an accessory, but a force. And that life is always worth choosing.